Hello, and thanks for stopping by. From Boudicca's bloodthirsty revolt, to pestilence and the devastation of the Blitz, London has endured many trials and tribulations during its near 2,000-year-long history, the most infamous of which has to be the Great Fire of London, a mighty conflagration which, over the course of several days and nights in early September 1666, reduced much of the old city to ash. The statistics speak for themselves. During the course of around 96 dreadful hours, 13,200 homes were destroyed, leaving 600,000 people homeless. 87 churches were gutted, as were 44 livery halls, and many other landmark buildings, such as Baynard's Castle, the Royal Exchange, and St Paul's Cathedral, were completely wiped out. In short, the city's medieval character was utterly annihilated. In this video, I'd like to take you on an in-depth journey through London's greatest calamity, showing you how the fire developed and spread, the streets across which it raged, what the experience was like for those on the ground, and in a few cases, where you can now find the rare handful of buildings which managed to survive the Inferno. London, go on still in thy wicked, presumptuous wickedness, so wrote a Quaker named Walter Costello in a pamphlet published in 1658. Put the evil day far from thee, and repent not. Do so, London. But, if fire make not ashes of the city, and thy bones, conclude me a liar for ever. London, repent or burn. Written 8 years before the Great Fire, Walter Costello's dire sermon would prove eerily prophetic, and he wasn't the only one to entertain such a vision. There were claims, most likely spurious, that both Nostradamus and Mother Shipton had foreseen the city's destruction, whilst in 1651, the astrologer William Lilly, in a book entitled Monarchy or No Monarchy in England, had presented a series of mysterious illustrations which included an image of London ablaze. So uncanny was William's vision, in fact, that in the wake of the disaster, he was suspected of being an arsonist who'd possibly started it, and so was called before a parliamentary committee to prove his innocence. Fortunately for William, he was able to clear his name, and he's now commemorated by a green plaque, which can be seen on the side of the abandoned Aldwych tube station. It wasn't only astrologers and soothsayers who had an impending sense of doom. With the number 666 given as the satanic mark of the beast in the Bible's apocalyptic Book of Revelation, many everyday folk in the mid-17th century feared the year 1666 would be one of considerable dread, and these were indeed turbulent times. In 1665, the Great Plague, which had also been eerily predicted by William Lilly, had swept across England, and it continued to cast its deadly bubonic shadow into 1666. By the time the Great Fire broke out, this horrific disease was on the wane, although by that point, it had claimed over 68,500 lives in London alone, and that's just a figure recorded at the time. In reality, historians estimate the toll was likely closer to 100,000, approximately 15% of the capital's population. In 1666, the nation was also at war with the Dutch, and there was ferocious animosity towards both French and Catholics, factors which, as we'll later see, fueled wild conspiracy theories and violent assaults as the blaze erupted. Furthermore, although the monarchy had been restored under Charles II in 1660, and many were glad to see the back of Oliver Cromwell's tyrannical reign, there were still pockets of disgruntled Republicans who fiercely opposed the king, and the possibility of terrorist-style violence, in a manner similar to the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, hung in the air. This threat almost came to pass, when in April 1666, a group of 8 such men, led by John Rathbone, who'd been a colonel in Cromwell's army, were arrested after their plot to overthrow the monarchy was discovered. Their audacious scheme, or as the great chronicler of the time, Samuel Pepys put it, their hellish design, sought to overthrow the government by seizing the Tower of London and setting fire to the city, blocking the gates of the metropolis as they did so in order to prevent any help from getting through. In a curious twist, the date for their incendiary attack had been set for the 3rd of September 1666, the anniversary of Oliver Cromwell's death, which, as it transpired, would be just one day after the Great Fire of London itself roared into life. Not that Rathbone and his men would have the satisfaction of seeing it, of course. They were sentenced to death, and, with their crime being treason, were executed by being hung, drawn and quartered. One of history's best known facts is that the Great Fire of London started at a bakery on Pudding Lane, a street located between Eastcheap and Lower Thames Street, close to the northern end of London Bridge. To modern ears, the word pudding evokes thoughts of cakes and sweet treats, especially when thought of in conjunction with a baker's. However, in the 1600s, pudding meant something far more different. You see, originally, it was a term that was used to describe offal, specifically pig and sheep entrails. It's why steak and kidney pudding is named so. And although there was indeed a bakery here, the street was better known for its butchers and slaughterhouses. The roads slope towards the river, the Thames being somewhat wider in those days, providing ideal in helping to drain blood and other detritus away. According to John Stowe, the first writer to chronicle London in detail, Pudding Lane was once known as the far more pleasant sounding Red Rose Lane, but adopted its gruesome new title after, quote, "The butchers of Eastcheap established their scalding houses for hogs here, and their puddings, with other filth of beasts, are voided down that way to their dung boats on the Thames." Although Stowe wrote that account in 1598, little would have changed by 1666. Pudding Lane was one of the city's most cramped thoroughfares, the narrowest of all according to one contemporary writer, who claimed there was barely room for a cart to pass through. For such a famous street though, Pudding Lane looks rather bland nowadays. If you want to gain some idea of what it looked like at the time of the fire, then you should take a walk down to the cobbled Lovett Lane, which is located only a minute or so away. The homes and shops which lined Pudding Lane, as with most in the city, were made from wattle and daub. In other words, wood, straw, soil, clay, and even animal dung. And the upper stories, known as jetties, usually jutted out like open drawers, so far out in many cases that they pressed against the buildings opposite. There are several buildings in London which survived the fire that can give us an idea as to how this architectural style would have appeared. This, for example, is Prince Henry's room, which is at number 17 Fleet Street. It dates from 1610, and at around the time of the Great Fire, it was a pub called the Fountain Tavern. Just a few doors up, opposite the Royal Court of Justice, at 229 Strand, is this building, which dates from 1625. Whilst up on Holborn, outside Chancery Lane Tube Station, you'll find Staple Inn, which gives the best hint as to how entire streets would have appeared in medieval London. Another example of this style can be found at 41 Cloth Fair. In fact, this building, which was built between 1597 and 1614, happens to be the oldest house within the City of London's historic square mile. Although building out jetties allowed for increased floor space on the upper levels, it was well known that they posed a great risk when it came to spreading fire, and the materials from which they were made were of course highly flammable. Even as far back as 1189, the city elders had insisted that all homes be forged from stone, although this order was blatantly ignored, Londoners instead preferring the far cheaper option of wood, wattle and daub. Consequently, London, specifically the original walled square mile, grew to become one vast tinderbox, so much so that on the 11th of April 1665, King Charles II wrote to the Lord Mayor to express his concerns about the danger and possibility of a large fire occurring. He couldn't have known how timely his anxiety would prove to be. The man who owned the bakery at what would become the Great Fire of London's ground zero was 51-year-old Thomas Farriner, who'd started his business in 1649. By 1666, he held the title Conduct of the King's Bakehouse, which meant he was contracted to bake bread and biscuits for the Royal Navy. As with most business owners in those days, Thomas lived above his place of work, along with his 3 children, a maid and a manservant. He was a widower, his wife Hannah having died in 1665. Late on the evening of Saturday the 1st of September 1666, the family retired to bed, no doubt glad that a breeze was stirring outside, signalling that autumn would soon be upon them, for the summer of 1666 had proved unusually hot and dry. Before turning in, Thomas, according to his testimony in an inquiry held into the fire, ensured the bakery's oven, similar to the one shown here, was fully extinguished. But I guess he would say that, wouldn't he? Although the bakery's shop front was indeed on Pudding Lane, the oven itself was located towards the back, meaning it would have been based roughly around this spot, on what's now Monument Street. At some point just after 1 AM on Sunday the 2nd of September, an ember, emanating from somewhere, drifted onto a bundle of sticks stored beside the oven. The fire took hold, and at around 2 AM, the Farriners awoke with smoke choking their lungs and the sound of crackling flames in their ears. They wasted no time in fleeing the danger, and in this instance, the close proximity of London's houses proved beneficial, for it allowed them to climb out of a window and onto the roof of their neighbour's house. Except for the Farriner's maid, that is, who, being afraid of heights, refused to go, sadly resulting in her becoming the Great Fire of London's first fatality. At first, the fire seemed like any other blaze. The city was no stranger to such incidents, and in a courtyard of a tavern called the Star Inn, which was on Fish Street Hill, parallel to Pudding Lane, a crowd gathered to watch the spectacle. The Star Inn was a galleried coaching tavern, similar to the George, which survives on the opposite side of London Bridge in Borough, and as such, it was stashed with hay for feeding horses, plus of course many bottles of highly flammable spirits. As the crowd watched, sparks and embers, carried on the strong westward breeze, fluttered through the air and settled on the tavern's roof, and before long, the Star Inn too was engulfed in flames. It was clear the situation was now becoming serious, leading the warden at nearby St Clement's to begin ringing the church bell, its ominous clanging marking the first warning of the blaze that would eventually consume the entire city. At around 3 AM, the then Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bludworth, was awoken with news of the developing fire, and as we'll see, he's a man who does not come out of this at all well. Bludworth lived on Maiden Lane, a now lost street which ran between Garlick Hill and College Hill, and no doubt grumpy at having been awoken, he walked the half-mile or so to inspect the scene. When he first saw the fire, the mayor was markedly unconcerned, and, according to legend, stated, "Pish, a woman might pit it out," after which he promptly trudged back to bed. At around the same time, Samuel Pepys, whose diary would so vividly recall the fire as it unfolded, was awoken by his maid, Jane. Pepys lived on Seething Lane, which is much closer to Pudding Lane, about a quarter of a mile, but, like the mayor, he too was initially unconcerned at first. "I thought it far off enough," he said, and so went to bed again, and to sleep. However, as dawn broke, it was clear matters were getting out of hand. Most of Fish Street Hill was now ablaze, and as the wind pushed south and west, the fire began to spread through warehouses lining the Thames, their highly flammable contents, such as tallow, oil, pitch and alcohol, feeding the blaze. Witnesses reported that explosions were heard in many of these warehouses, suggesting that, due to the intense heat, many materials were self-combusting before the flames could even reach them. Also close to the Thames were the churches St Magnus the Martyr and St Lawrence Pountney, and they too succumbed to the blaze, their tall flaming spires acting as grim beacons to those further afield. These two churches were located on either side of London Bridge, and that too caught fire. Fortunately, a gap in properties on the northern end acted as a fire break, Sparing the entire structure from destruction, although the fire continued to roar where it could, cutting the bridge off as an escape route. The section of London Bridge that was on fire also happened to be the location of a major water pump. Powered by a large wheel which turned in the arch below, this apparatus would have been of immense use to those battling the flames, and its loss, along with the dry conditions and strong westerly wind, proved to be one of the many cruel twists of fate which facilitated the fire's terrifying spread. After awaking at 7 AM, Samuel Pepys walked a short distance to the Tower of London to gain a better view of the fire, which, despite only being a few hours old, had already destroyed 300 houses. In his role as the naval administrator, Pepys knew King Charles II personally, and realising how grave the situation was, decided to request an audience with him. He therefore hired a boat from Tower Hill, in the midst of what was quickly becoming a chaotic scene, as many other Londoners, laden with whatever they could carry, were doing the same. As his boat set off, Pepys noted how pigeons were beginning to tumble from the sky, the poor creatures having their wings scorched by the flames, which in some cases would soon leap to an estimated 30 foot high. Over at Westminster, which in those days was a notably separate entity to the old walled city of London, people already had an inkling that something terrible was afoot. Being a Sunday morning, Westminster Abbey was packed for a service. For latecomers it was standing room only, and at some time between 10 and 11 AM, a group of people burst in with news of the fire. One young man, William Taswell, recalled exiting the Abbey and seeing boats packed with fleeing people on the Thames. He also bore witness to a particularly ugly scene, as a hastily gathered mob, convinced the fire had been deliberately set by a foreign agent, began hunting for someone to unleash their fury upon. In doing so, they singled out an innocent French blacksmith, striking him with an iron bar, which caused blood, as William described, to flow in a plentiful stream down to his ankles. Over the following days, there would be a number of other similar shameful assaults amongst the raging flames, as the false belief prevailed that the fire had been an act of sabotage. Samuel Pepys, meanwhile, had arrived at the Palace of Whitehall, which itself would be swept away in an almighty blaze some years later, where he quickly presented the king with everything he knew about the unfolding events. Also present was Charles's younger brother, James the Duke of York, along with Lord Arlington and several other ministers. During the plague, Charles, who was initially regarded to be something of a playboy party animal, had left London, a decision for which he had been greatly criticised. The Great Fire, however, would provide him with a golden PR opportunity, a way to redeem himself, and, to their credit, both the king and his brother James acted admirably throughout the crisis, taking a very hands-on approach. Charles's first act was to establish a chain of couriers, through who news and messages could be quickly relayed. He also arranged for all available firefighting equipment to be sent to the city, and ordered the King's Guard to step in, both to enforce law and order and to help battle the flames. Charles then told Samuel Pepys to inform the mayor that no time should be wasted in pulling down houses to act as fire breaks. Granted the use of a royal coach, Pepys headed back with this message towards the city. However, upon approaching Watling Street, close to St Paul's Cathedral, the coach driver found the way blocked by people fleeing westwards. The streets were full of nothing but people and horses with goods, ready to run over one another, Pepys wrote. And so, with the route jammed, he alighted and set off on foot, pushing his way towards Cannon Street. Here he encountered the mayor, who, it would seem, was not handling the crisis very well at all. Pepys was already acquainted with Bludworth, and had formed a low opinion of him. In June 1666, 2 months before the fire, he had written in his diary that Bludworth was, quote, "a silly man I think, and a very weak man he seems to be." And now, as the mayor stood on Cannon Street, Pepys claimed, he cried like a fainting woman, exclaiming, "Lord, what can I do? I am spent." When Pepys told the mayor that the king had ordered the creation of fire breaks no matter what, the mayor's response was lacklustre. He claimed some buildings had been pulled down, but the fire was always ahead of them, which to be fair would have been the case given the strong wind. He was reluctant to pull down further homes in any great number though, his reasoning being that property owners would have to be compensated. Disgusted, Pepys moved on, and from this point onwards, Bludworth's leadership with regards to the fire became non-existent. He was spotted later that day by another witness, who described him as looking like one frightened out of his wits, and due to his inaction, Bludworth rapidly became the most despised man in London. As Sunday afternoon approached, the flames reached Lombard Street, one of the city's wealthiest and most picturesque places, famous for its hanging signs denoting the emblems of the merchants and bankers who worked there. Whilst down at Queenhithe, Charles and his brother James arrived via royal barge. After docking, the king climbed to the roof of a nearby house to observe the extent of the fire, and upon hearing that the mayor and city elders were still whining about the financial burden of pulling down houses, he snapped that, if any property owner had a problem, then they would have to take it up with him personally. Meanwhile, over its bankside on the south side of the Thames, the writer John Evelyn had travelled up from Greenwich to view the unfolding catastrophe. "With my wife and son, took a coach and went to Bankside in Southwark," he wrote, "where we beheld the dismal spectacle, the whole city in dreadful flames near the waterside. What would become of the rest?" As Sunday evening wore on, the fire roared with terrifying speed. The Steelyard complex, owned by the powerful German trading confederation known as the Hanseatic League, was consumed. Cannon Street Station now covers the spot, and nearby Dowgate went up in flames. Cloak Lane was engulfed too, taking with it the post office, an extremely important building in 1666, as all of the nation's correspondence passed through it, and this destruction of communications further fueled fears that sedition was at hand. The postmaster, James Hicks, was quick to act however. After rescuing a number of packages, he carted his family off to safety in what was then a rural and very distant Barnet, and then proceeded to establish an emergency post office at the Golden Lion Inn on Red Cross Street, a site that's now lost beneath the Barbican complex, from where he quickly dispatched news of the disaster to other parts of the kingdom. Close to Red Cross Street was St Giles' Cripplegate, which survived the fire, although it suffered considerable damage in the century since through other blazes and war. As nights drew on, Queenhithe, where the king had been only a few hours before, went up, along with Billingsgate Fish Market. Then, at around midnight, an especially beloved London landmark fell victim: the Boar's Head, a tavern on Eastcheap, located approximately here, which was well known for once being Shakespeare's favourite pub. Fortunately, you can still drink in 3 pubs which survived the Great Fire. These are the Hoop and Grapes on Aldgate High Street, which was established in 1593, the Seven Stars on Carey Street, close to Lincoln's Inn Fields, which opened in 1602, and the Old Wine Shades on Martin Street, which dates from 1663, and as the name suggests, is now a wine bar. By Monday morning, the fire was beginning to advance north, its main path being along Gracechurch Street, and down at Tower Hill, the area was busier than ever as countless Londoners scrambled to evacuate, finding, in many cases, that the ferrymen were cashing in on the crisis by charging exorbitant rates. Meanwhile, James, the Duke of York, had established an emergency headquarters at Ely Place, Holborn, from where an attempt was made to direct the firefighting. Ely Place also happens to be the site of another of the Great Fire's survivors, St Ethelreda's Church, which was built in the late 1200s. From the HQ at Ely Place, orders were made to set up fire posts at Temple Bar, Clifford's Inn Gardens, Fetter Lane, Show Lane, Cow Lane in Smithfield, Cripplegate, Aldersgate and Coleman Streets, the locations forming a rough arc around the western perimeter of the city. Overseen by a military officer and 30 troops, plus around 100 civilian volunteers, each fire post was granted the handsome sum of £5 for the purpose of purchasing cheese, bread and beer to keep the men going. Firefighting in those days was of course extremely rudimentary, and given the conditions and ferocity of the blaze, there was little, in reality, that could be done. At the time, most equipment was stored inside churches, those items namely being leather buckets for carrying water, and heavy hooks for pulling down buildings, although as the fire progressed, gunpowder was employed to blow up properties with greater speed. If you were lucky, you got a hard hat, like this one, and there are a number of fire engines too, although these were very basic contraptions and a far cry from what we today would call a fire engine, essentially being large wooden tubs on wheels from which weak jets of water could be squirted. The long, hot, dry summer of 1666 had resulted in a drought, making matters all the more worse, and in a desperation to find water, those battling the flames resorted to ripping up the cobbled streets in an attempt to locate water conduits, wells, and even sewers. As Monday wore on, St Michael Paternoster, the site of Dick Whittington's tomb, was ablaze. Whilst down by the Thames, the fire reached a crowded, slum-like area, where workshops churning out commodities such as soap and glue were crammed, the materials involved releasing a pungent, disgusting smell as they burned. By 3 PM, Lombard Street was completely wiped out, leading the blaze to creep across towards Cornhill, even though a substantial firebreak had been made there, with all of the houses on the south side being pulled down. As Cornhill burned, so too did Threadneedle Street, along with another London landmark, the Royal Exchange, a huge building which, first opened by Queen Elizabeth I in 1571, acted as a vital trading and commercial hub, similar to the present-day stock exchange. At the same time, the area around Bread Street and Friday Street fell to the flames, along with Cheapside, which, being packed with luxury shops, was a major shopping destination in 17th century London. Bucklersbury was consumed too, and being the area where the city's pharmaceutical trade was centred, this resulted in an array of strange odours entering the mix, as all manner of exotic potions and compounds went up in smoke. By now, the Inferno sounded like an almighty roar. One observer described the cacophony as sounding like 1,000 iron chariots beating upon the stones. Amongst this furious commotion, other sounds would have been present too. The smashing of glass, walls crashing down, the whinnying of horses, and the cries of people calling out in fear and desperation. The horrendous scene shrouded in an acrid yellow smoke, through which the sun loomed blood red. Thousands of residents continued to make their escape. Those who couldn't secure a boat attempted to leave via any of the 7 gates dotted around the city's wall, although this resulted in huge jams. All of those city gates have long since vanished, although we can get some idea of how they appeared by looking at St Bartholomew's Gatehouse in Smithfield, a survivor of the Great Fire which dates from 1595. Those who managed to push beyond the all-encircling London Wall discovered that there were few carts to be hired, as all traffic to the city had been halted, leaving people to set up camp wherever they could. Those stuck within the city walls, meanwhile, made their way to the relative safety of Moorfields and Finsbury Fields. It was at night that the Inferno was most terrifying, the vast towering flames illuminating the night sky, producing a long thick plume of smoke which stretched all the way to Oxford, meaning it was at least 50 miles in length. Meanwhile, in places as far afield as Windsor and Beaconsfield, scraps of paper that had been in the city's churches and counting houses just hours before fluttered to earth after being carried by the hellish cloud. At around 9 PM on Monday night, another major London landmark caught fire, Baynard's Castle, a former fortification which in 1666 was a huge royal palace. There was some hope that night though. Using a fire break just north of Leadenhall, a team managed to halt the spread of the fire. Their action spared both the headquarters of the East India Company, along with 2 churches, St Katherine Cree on Leadenhall Street, which as it appears now was built in around 1504, and St Andrew Undershaft, which dates from 1532, and can be found on the junction of St Mary Axe. The third day of the Great Fire of London, Tuesday the 4th of September 1666, is generally regarded to be the most calamitous. That morning, the fire roared along Fleet Street and erupted through the city's western wall. The increasing danger didn't stop the king, however, who, when not helping carry buckets of water, galloped through the city on horseback, dishing out golden coins as an incentive to remain and fight the flames, whilst his brother James narrowly avoided being burnt alive close to Salisbury Court. On the junction of Poultry and Old Jewry, brave volunteers managed to hold the fire back until 5 PM, at which point the cruel wind, ever mocking, swept the flames high over their heads, setting the eastern end of Cheapside ablaze. It was also on Tuesday that Samuel Pepys, whilst attempting to traverse the city with his friend and neighbour William Penn, the man who would go on to found Pennsylvania, approached the now long lost Tower Street, where they found themselves beaten back by the ferocious Inferno. As Tower Street was just moments away from where he lived, Pepys, who'd already had some of his property sent to Bethnal Green and Deptford, was convinced his home would soon go up in smoke, and so set about burying a number of smaller valuables in his garden, most famously a large block of Parmesan cheese, an item that was an extremely expensive delicacy at the time. Fortunately, thanks to William Penn arranging for buildings on Seething Lane to be blown up with gunpowder, Pepys' home was spared, as was his local church, St Olave's. It would seem the action instigated by William Penn helped save the Tower of London from destruction too. Just as well really, as several thousand barrels of gunpowder were stored there, and had they been ignited, it would have no doubt detonated with the power of a small nuclear device. Also saved in this vicinity was the church of All-Hallows-by-the-Tower, the City of London's oldest church, although sadly it suffered considerable damage centuries later during the Blitz. Elsewhere in the city, Chancery Lane and St Bride's Church, along with its entire surrounding parish, were engulfed, whilst the Old Bailey Courthouse and the neighbouring Newgate Jail also caught fire. This necessitated the hasty evacuation of inmates from the prison, and as they were transported to cells at other locations, many of them managed to escape, adding an extra criminal element to the looting, extortion, and conspiracy-fueled beatings which were already flourishing amongst the flames. By now, Guildhall, the heart of the City of London's administration, was aflame, resulting in the destruction of two famous statues located there, the effigies of Gog and Magog, two mythical giants who, according to legend, are the city's guardians. You can see smaller versions of them today, beside the clock of St Dunstan in the west on Fleet Street. Despite the colossal destruction that had already ensued, St Paul's Cathedral, in a manner similar to the famous photograph that would later be taken during the Blitz in December 1940, had so far managed to remain untouched, standing like an island, firm against the smoke and flame. The St Paul's of 1666 dated from the Norman era, and amazingly, it was slightly larger than today's Grand Incarnation, being wider, its footprints marked out by this garden, and taller, although the towering wooden spire had been destroyed by lightning in 1561. Despite the loss of its spire, St Paul's, as contemporary illustrations show, remains dominant, and for many Londoners no doubt provided some comfort as it stood stoically by. However, the Inferno could not be held back forever. At the time of the fire, the cathedral was surrounded by wooden scaffolding, and at around 8 PM on Tuesday evening, the fire began to lick at the structure. Soon, St Paul's was engulfed, the fire fueled by thousands of books, which local booksellers, who worked in the surrounding churchyard, had stashed there for supposed safekeeping. As the flames raged higher, the mighty cathedral collapsed in on itself, its lead roof melting and running down Ludgate Hill in a molten hot stream. Within just a few grim hours, the iconic 500-year-old landmark had been reduced to charred rubble. As Wednesday unfolded, there were fears that the Great Fire of London was on course to engulf Westminster. Indeed, it had already consumed the area of Whitefriars, or as it was then known, Alsatia, a crowded slum west of the now submerged River Fleet, which was known for its high levels of crime, the crowded shoddy structures there providing the ideal catalyst for the fire's spread. Next to Alsatia was, and still is, the legal district known as the Inner Temple, which had been barricaded off by the lawyers who lived there due to fears of looting. Being surrounded by brick walls, the Inner Temple felt relatively shielded from the fire. However, on that fourth day, sparks managed to leap over the boundary, setting fire to and completely destroying the Lamb Building, resulting in the loss of many important books and documents. The Lamb Building has since been reconstructed. As the fire spread further west, panic began to take hold in Westminster, leading houses on the Strand to be blown up with gunpowder. Back at Seething Lane, Samuel Pepys, who'd been up all night burying his cheese, made arrangements to evacuate his family to Woolwich. And it was whilst on the little ferry that he and the boatman noticed a change in the wind, for it was beginning to blow more southward, in other words down towards the Thames, a change in weather which would soon prove to be a godsend. The drop in wind was noticed elsewhere in the city too, and at Pike Corner, near Smithfield Market, the change enabled teams to finally bring the flames under control. And the blaze, having already consumed most of what it could, died down, the flames flickering out, and the fire dying almost as quickly as it had started. Following his admirable conduct throughout the fire, Giles II now had a final important task, that being to calm people's suspicions that the fire had been a deliberate act. To do so, he rode to Moorfields, where he addressed a huge crowd of refugees, telling them that the disaster was nothing to do with the Catholics, French or the Dutch. It had, he said, been caused by the hand of God. On Thursday morning, small fires still burned here and there, and it was reported numerous ones still crackled away for weeks, and even months afterwards, although the parading sight in the Inferno's wake was of a mass of charred ruins. In the immediate aftermath, William Tazwell, the young man who we encountered earlier in this story at Westminster Abbey, found himself walking towards the ruins of the devastated St Paul's Cathedral. The ground was so hot as to almost scorch my shoes, he recalled, and the air was unbearably warm. Once at the cathedral, William encountered a disturbing sight. Near the east wall of St Paul's, a human body presented itself to me, parched up as it were, with the flames. This was an old decrepit woman who'd fled here for safety, imagining the flames would have not reached her here. Her clothes were burnt, and every limb reduced to coal. Amazingly, only 6 people were recorded as having perished in the Great Fire of London. The unfortunate, unnamed woman William saw was one of them, along with 2 other souls who'd also sought refuge within the doomed St Paul's. The other victims were, as seen earlier, Thomas Farriner's maid, who'd refused to climb out of the window, a fellow named Richard Yerd, who was found in the parish of St Mary Woolnoth after being overcome by smoke, and Paul Lowell, a deaf watchmaker in his 80s, who stubbornly refused to abandon his home on Show Lane. It's uncertain if others died, although it certainly wouldn't be surprising. Given the level of destruction, it's possible some bodies lay undiscovered, or simply too burnt to be recognised as human, whilst the recording of deaths of those in the city's poorer areas was mediocre at the best of times. The fire was certainly responsible for a number of indirect deaths. There were the shameful lynchings, and it's known that a number of people were crushed by falling debris as they searched through the ruins of their devastated homes. It's also probable that as autumn and winter drew on, a percentage of those made homeless would have succumbed to starvation or exposure as they were forced to camp outside for many months, and in some cases years, after the fire, whilst other Londoners who'd once owned thriving businesses found themselves utterly destitute. The most notorious indirect death was that of Robert Hubert, a watchmaker from Rouen, who, despite Charles II's insistence that the fire had been a dreadful accident, was tried and found guilty of starting the blaze, resulting in his execution at Tyburn, beside modern-day Marble Arch, on the 27th of October 1666. Although Hubert had confessed to the fire, it's widely regarded that he was not of sound mind, and, worse still, may have been subjected to torture. A fellow Frenchman named Graves claimed that Hubert was, quote, a person of mischievous inclination, fit for any villainous enterprise. Although having said that, he also claimed that, in this instance, Hubert was merely attention-seeking. One man who was adamant that Hubert was the culprit was the baker Thomas Farriner, owner of that fateful bakery on Pudding Lane, so much so that he signed the bill against Hubert. Now I wonder why he would do that. Thomas Farriner, by the way, re-established his bakery at the same location. I bet he kept an extra close eye on the ovens in the new place, and he died in 1670. The damage caused by the Great Fire of London was estimated, in 1666 money, to have totalled £10 million, which would be approximately 36 billion today. The city was of course rebuilt, using far less flammable materials, although the opportunity to redraw the streets using broader, wider boulevards was passed over, Londoners preferring instead to keep to the ancient map, which they had become so used to. Today, a number of nods to the Great Fire can be found within the city. This, for example, is the Golden Boy of Pye Corner. Pye Corner, which is near West Smithfield, being the place where control was gained over the flames, and as such is generally regarded to be the spot where the Great Fire of London officially ended. As the fire started on Pudding Lane and ended at Pye Corner, Londoners figured that the blaze was likely a punishment from God for the sin of gluttony, which is why this tubby little fellow, erected in the late 17th century, was chosen to warn against greed. The monument, worthy of a video in its own right, was built close to Pudding Lane to commemorate the fire, and remains a popular attraction today. If you're fit enough, a climb to the top is well worth it, as the views up there are spectacular, and arguably, Monument's namesake underground station is the only tube station to have a name directly connected to the Great Fire. The base of the monument, meanwhile, is emblazoned with a frieze by the Danish sculptor Kees Sieber, which chronicles those destructive few days. The monument itself was designed by Robert Hooke and Sir Christopher Wren, Wren of course being the genius who masterminded the majority of the rebuilding of the city, including the glorious New St Paul's Cathedral, where, if you look up on the southern wall, you'll see another reference to the fire. A phoenix rising from the flames, along with the Latin word resurgam, I shall rise again. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this journey through the Great Fire of London, and I'd be interested to hear your own thoughts on this historic disaster. Have you seen any of the surviving buildings? Do you think 6 people is a suspiciously low death toll? And what do you reckon when it comes to Thomas Fariner saying Robert Hubert was to blame? Please be sure to let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you so much to all of you who support my channel with your kind words, likes and shares. I couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course it would be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.